Hello and welcome back to another episode of Sermon Braindump. My name is Scott Dalen, an ELCA pastor in Southwest Iowa, and I present these videos normally every week for a couple of different reasons. The first of which is to take my brain out of the mode of background work over the course of the week and move into the process of actually writing and prepping the sermon that I'll preach to my congregation for the weekend. That's the first reason. And the second is just to allow you, the viewer, who have graciously given of your time to come by and watch my random ramblings, to gain some different insight into the assigned text for the week. So that is why I do these. It's been a minute, or a week or two, in actuality, since I produced a video, going back to right before Christmas, as I was off on vacation here last week. But we're back at it now, this time around. And here we are, January 6th, 2019. Holy smokes, Happy New Year, everyone. We got a new year. The calendar has rolled over and we are into another one again. This particular Sunday is Epiphany. And this is one of the rare years when Epiphany, the day of Epiphany, actually falls on a Sunday, which means that I'll be preaching on it. Usually, Epiphany is not on Sunday. It's a specific day. It's January 6th every year, 12 days after Christmas. And it is when we celebrate or recognize the beginning of Jesus being revealed to the world. That's really what the season of Epiphany is aimed at. We'll continue to see different ways that comes up over the course of the next several weeks. Normally, the first one that we get in Epiphany is the baptism of our Lord when we look at Jesus' baptism. That will actually be next week, as it's always the first Sunday after Epiphany. Well, since Epiphany falls on Sunday, it's a week later this time around. But this is the story of the Magi, or the wise men, as they're typically called. But wise men is really, or three kings sometimes they're called as well. Magi is the best way of saying that. It's their story as they appear to worship the born king of Israel, and the intrigue that we get around King Herod, which was Herod the Great. Really the first of the Herods, the one to establish the Herodian dynasty, and his reaction to things. So that's kind of where this is. Now, we won't get the entire story. It actually cuts off some of the back end of this, which is the remainder of the second chapter of Matthew, which is where we're at. It is that will actually pop up like almost a year from now. It's during the time after the season of Christmas. I think it's the second Sunday of Christmas in year A, which is the year of Matthew, which will hit next fall, like end of 2019. So almost a year from now is when this back half will come up. But coming back around, I'm feeling a little out of practice here. So the assigned gospel for this week is out of Matthew. Matthew 2, 1 through 12, and that's always the assigned gospel text for the day of Epiphany. One of those rare instances throughout the church year where it's the same scripture readings every year, as opposed to the ones that change every 3 years. So we get the first part of this story, and then as I mentioned, the back part, which I'll probably also reference because I think it's pretty important. It pops up in the lectionary roughly 11 and a half months from now, and then not again for 3 more years. Oh, joy. So okay, so I'm going to go ahead and read this, and then we'll get into it. So, in the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, wise men came from the east to Jerusalem, asking, "Where is the child who has been born King of the Jews? For we observed his star at its rising and have come to pay him homage." When King Herod heard this, he was frightened, and all Jerusalem with him. And calling together all the chief priests and the scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. They told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it has been written by the prophet. And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who is to shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod secretly called for the wise men and learned from them the exact time when the star had happened. Then he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word so that I may go and pay him homage." When they had heard the king, they set out, and there ahead of them went the star that they had seen at its rising, until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw that the star had stopped, they were overwhelmed with joy. On entering the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they knelt down and paid him homage. Then, opening their treasure chests, they offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they left for their own country by another road. Okay, so that's the reading. That's the Magi story for the most part. In fact, that is their story. After this, they kind of fade out. They're referenced again a few verses later, but that's kind of it. So there's a lot of stuff going on here. Now, this is the passage that immediately follows the birth of Jesus, which happens at the end of chapter 1. But some time has passed. Now, here's the funny thing about all this, that when we think of the Magi or the wise men, we usually tend to think of them being at the nativity, being at the birth of Jesus, and they weren't. They were not present. They do not overlap with the shepherds coming and the birth of Jesus. So even though our thought, our usual idea of the Christmas pageant always has the wise men, they weren't there. And they showed up later, could be months, and even as long as a couple of years, which we find in some of the following verses. So some time has passed. So Jesus is not a newborn. He's a little bit older, maybe upwards of a couple years old already when they show up. But what's interesting is we don't know a ton about these guys. Now, Magi, kings is not the right way to describe it. They were probably like court astrologers or the scientists of the day, which would be a way of thinking about that. But they closely follow astrology. And because of that, they've witnessed this oddball star. There's a lot of different thoughts and theories about why they interpreted it the way they did, and what is their background, and what is their culture, and why would that be important. But regardless of why, is that they recognize the significance of it, and they come from somewhere in the east, whether it's from Persia or whether it's from the Orient or whether it's from Babylon. They come somewhere and approach it following the star. Now, some interesting stuff goes on here. They go to Herod. They go to Jerusalem. They don't go straight to Bethlehem, which is apparently where Jesus still is. They go to Jerusalem thinking, and they pretty much apparently announce themselves to King Herod and ask, where is the born king of the Jews? Now, why is this significant? This is significant for a couple of different reasons. One, apparently the star didn't take them straight to the source. Even though the signs are revealed in nature that God is up to something, it doesn't reveal everything. And so they need some help. They need some expert advice. So they go to the ones who will have it, which are we hear Herod calls the chief priests and the scribes. They're like the probably the Sanhedrin, which is like the ruling council of the Jewish culture and faith. And they look at the prophets, and the prophets say, born in Bethlehem, which Bethlehem is just literally right down the road, a couple of miles away from Jerusalem, so it's not far away. And yet they need that. So what happens here? We hear that Herod and all of Jerusalem with him, which is probably a little bit of a exaggeration. It's probably like the people who he had called to talk about, start quaking in their boots. It says they're greatly disturbed or frightened here. Those are okay translations, but greatly disturbed. Like, this is earth-shattering for them. And to begin to understand why, we need to take a look at Herod. Now, Herod's history is interesting. His family was not Jewish by birth. His father converted to Judaism a generation before. From what I've read, now don't take all of this as gospel, but from what I've read, Herod's father was an important figure in the region and passed on to Herod a title, and that title eventually was recognized by the Roman government, and he was granted king of this area, king of the Jews. So he was given this title. He was not born that way. And that's why the statement of the wise men, or the Magi, the one born king of the Jews, why that is so important. Because if there was one who was born king of the Jews, that means Herod's not. And that means that's a threat to his authority and to his power. And now, if you know anything about Herod, he was probably a pretty good ruler in terms of what he accomplished. He was a very prolific builder. There's a structure in in Israel, just not very far, just a few miles outside of Jerusalem. It's called the Herodium. It is a man-made mountain that had a very elaborate structure at the top. Now that's all in ruins now, but that was one of the many things that he had built. He built a mountain, or he commanded to have built a mountain and a fortress. It is thought that he was actually buried there after he died, but that was just one example. So he accomplished a lot of things, but he was also extraordinarily paranoid. He was bloodthirsty. If he thought anyone was a threat to his authority, he had them killed, including several of his kids. He basically was able to claim this ruling authority by marrying either the daughter or a sister. I don't exactly remember what it was, but one of the ruling parties following the Maccabean Revolution, which had happened a couple generations ahead of time, a very, 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 very brief period when Israel was self-governed again, but it was very short-lived before the Romans came in, and so he married into that family, and because of his wife, he was able to claim some sort of authority that way. But he was so paranoid that he oftentimes ordered, like, if I don't come back from this, my wife needs to be killed because no one else can become king, something like that. I don't know all the details, but Herod was the epitome of a jerk. And we actually will see that later on too, in the later passage, the later part of chapter 2. It's called the slaughter of the innocents. After he figures out that the wise men the Magi had taken off and had not come back to him, he ordered the death of all the baby boys 2 years and under from the city that were born there, and because he thought that would get Jesus. Well, it didn't get Jesus because Joseph had been warned in a dream of the pending danger, and so he took Mary and Jesus off to Egypt, and they were exiles, or they were refugees in Egypt for a period of time until Herod died, and then actually when Herod's next in line died, and then they came back. And there's dream warnings going on all over the place. The notion of important divine messages showing up in dreams is scattered, all over these first couple of chapters. So God is up to something really big, really, 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 really big. So where I'm going with this and why I'm focusing in so much on Herod, we tend to think of Herod the Great as being just the worst. The guy's the epitome of the evil bad guy. If he had a mustache, he must have twisted it, that kind of thing. And yet, his reaction, and not just his, but apparently some of the other important people in Jerusalem as well, is when there is a threat to their power, they react with fear and they react with violence. And that is the way of the world. And that seems to be pretty fitting for our current day and age of when there is a threat to power, do everything you can to discredit it or destroy it. And it's the idea of might makes right, and yet God is doing something so utterly different. And whatever it is that God is up to through Jesus, it's apparent even at the time of his birth and the time of his when he's still a baby, that is an ultimate threat to what the world says is power, and the world will react violently to try and protect itself. And yet it can't. The world can't. The power of the authority of the world cannot stand before it. So that's the direction that I'm going with this sermon. I'm going to wrap this up. I'm starting to get a little long-winded, but there's more to come. There's more in this story before the end of chapter 2, and then we move into the adult Jesus and the baptism and everything. But next week we'll actually be jumping back into Luke. So we're in the year of Luke now. So this is just a foray into Matthew because of the story of the Magi, which is only present here in Matthew. So if you have thoughts, questions, comments, throw them down in the comment section. We will continue the conversation that way. Otherwise, I hope you have a great, blessed week, and we will catch you next time.